Good evening, everyone. My name is Menachem Creditor. It's my honor to serve as scholar in residence and rabbi for UJA Federation of New York. On behalf of UJA and our partner in the Folio series, 70 Faces Media, welcome to what I know will be an extraordinary program. Thank you so much to all of us, our amazing New York Jewish community, for all you've enabled us to do here at UJA, especially since October 7th. At 495 days and counting, it is increasingly clear that healing and rebuilding a nation in trauma is not the work of a day, a week, or even months. It will take years, and we're going to be there every step of the way. To date, UJA has allocated more than $167 million to address every imaginable need and some unimaginable needs across the country. And at the same time, we're also intently focused on fighting back against unrelenting anti-Semitism, especially supporting our students on campus and working to confront anti-Jewish and anti-Israel hatred wherever it rears its head. The best antidote to anti-Semitism is living our proudest and best Jewish lives. That's why UJA is investing even more in strengthening Jewish experiences and Jewish life, including this phenomenal opportunity to learn with one of the greatest living scholars of our people's history and of history in general. I won't try to encapsulate our speaker's bio or his teaching, but I will say that I looked to Lincoln for some quotes in thinking about how to reflect Jewishly on this moment. And so there are two quotes that stood out to me because as people claim religion as the backing of their fight, Lincoln is a really interesting voice on that too. He said, in great contests, each party claims to act in accordance with the will of God, and both may be, and one must be, wrong. There's a theological humility that we could all learn from such a spokesperson, a devoted student of the Bible who also said in a second inaugural that both sides in the war, speaking of the Civil War, read the same Bible, pray to the same God, and each invokes God's aid against the other. And I would say as a rabbi, deeply proud to be an American, deeply proud to be Jewish, we would do well to claim less God in the fire of our fight. To know, as Lincoln said elsewhere, he wasn't so sure that God was on his side, but he wanted to make sure that he would be on God's side. And part of this we learn from our own history. So to invoke one verse from this week's Parsha, and then to very gratefully hand off the Zoom podium to my partners in this great work. In this week's Parsha, Moshe, our teacher, Moshe Rabbeinu, Moses, our teacher, re-meets his family. And we learn the names of his sons. In fact, they aren't even called his sons in this parsha. They're Tzipporah's sons. And the language is V'shnei vaneh asher shem ha'echad Gershom, ki amar ger hayiti be'eretz nochriya, v'shem ha'echad Eliezer ki Elohei avi be'ezri v'yatzileni mecherev paro. In English, one son's name was Gershom, which means I was a stranger in a strange land. And the other was named Eliezer, meaning the God of my father's house came to my help, delivering me from the sword of Pharaoh. We are in a moment where vulnerability is ubiquitous. We really do feel the need for help and the echoes of the most vulnerable moments of Jewish history. No matter what our political position, nobody feels great right now. I don't know that anyone ever really did. It's interesting to think about the name choices for Moses and Zipporah's sons. Why would anyone name their child, I was a stranger in a strange land, unless the goal is to remember, of course, that exile and alienation are part of our history, something we seek an antidote for. Tonight's learning might even help us remember what it was to seek solace and comfort in something bigger than the self that could speak with humility on behalf of a nation. And so I'd like to close these very brief introductory remarks with one more quote. The day, the moment that Lincoln found out that he won the election, he said this, without a name, perhaps without a reason why I should have a name, there has fallen upon me a task such as did not rest even upon the father of his country. There is humility and an acceptance of responsibility there too. Moses wasn't Abraham, and we are not Lincoln, and Lincoln was not Washington, but we have work to do in this world. And without saying too much about my teacher, Professor Sarna, I just want to say that in his introduction to his book, American Judaism, he calls upon us not just to be students of history, but to recognize our responsibilities in writing its next chapter. So it's my honor, representing UJA, to hand the mantle of this introductory moment to my friend, my partner in this work, Tia Wieseltier. Tia, all yours.
Thank you, Rabbi Creditor. Good evening, everyone. I'm Thea Wieseltier, Director of Public Programs at 70 Faces Media, and I, too, thank you for joining the New York Jewish Week and UJA Federation for our monthly Folio literary series. And now to our program. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome American historian and author Jonathan D. Sarna to discuss his newly published book, co-authored with Benjamin Chappell, Lincoln and the Jews. Benjamin Chappell is the founder of the Chappell Manuscript Foundation, and this book includes brand new and never seen before documents from this collection. We are also delighted to welcome Laura Arnold Liebman. Laura is the Leonard J. Milberg Professor in American Jewish Studies at Princeton University. Her work focuses on religion and the daily lives of women and children in early America and uses everyday objects to help bring their stories back to life. She is president of the Association for Jewish Studies and the author of many, many award-winning books. Welcome, Laura.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here tonight and to be in conversation with Professor Jonathan Sarna, who I feel like is one of those rare people who really does need no introduction, but I'll go ahead and give a little bit of the glimpse into his very illustrious career. Jonathan really is the preeminent scholar of American Jewish history today. He's the professor, University Professor and Joseph H. and Bell R. Brown Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. He is a member of the Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies, and he's also been the chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History, which I think gives you a small glimpse of some of the many huge highlights of his career. He's the author of many, many, many books that I assume some of you will have read. If not, you should rush out and get them. I would say some of my absolute favorites from him are his incredible history of American Judaism, as well as his book on when General Grant expelled the Jews, which I think will have wide appeal to people who are here tonight as well. I would say also it's been such an honor to be able to be in conversation with Professor Sarna in the past and for tonight, because he's one of those people who's not just a scholar, but is truly a mensch and has been such a mentor to so many people in our field that it's really hard for me to imagine what American Jewish Studies would be without his tremendous work and his mentorship of all of us. So happy to be here tonight. And as another early Americanist, I'm super excited about this book on Lincoln. And I wanted to just start off by asking Jonathan some questions. I assume some of you will have already read this book, but I'm going to have him give a little bit of a tease of it as well. Can you just tell us a little bit about what you feel this book adds to that larger story of Lincoln, something beyond what most people might have already known about who Lincoln is as a president? Jonathan, I can't hear you again for some reason.
Well, can you hear me now?
Yeah, you're good.
All right. We're having some tech problems. I thought we solved them, but we didn't. All right. First of all, we should wish everyone happy Lincoln's birthday. It's the appropriate day for this book. This volume, uh, I think, will be astonishing to even Lincoln scholars and to most American Jews. We imagine Jews in the 20th century. And yet you open the book and there is a chart of all the Jews whom Lincoln knew. And it's really astonishing. Now, it's worth remembering there is no previous president who had so many interactions with Jews as Lincoln did. Um, and that chart demonstrates it. Lincoln's predecessor didn't much like Jews, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, was really an anti-Semite, as we know from his private papers. There were a lot of other people he didn't like, but anyway, um, I I think the fact that Lincoln had many Jewish friends and thought quite a lot about Jews, I think will be new to people. And of course, the volume also introduces many Jewish aspects of the Civil War, some of which people may know as General Grant's expulsion of Jews from his war zone, and Lincoln reversed that order. Really, as soon as he learned of it, the whole history of Jews in America would have been different had he not acted instantly in that way. But then there are pieces that people, I think, don't realize. The fact that Lincoln worked behind the scenes to include Jews in the chaplaincy. The original chaplaincy bill really stipulated that you had to be a minister of some Christian denomination. Now, we know that at least many of those who voted for it simply wanted to make sure that chaplains would really be properly trained, but their language, as happens occasionally in Congress, had unintended consequences. When it was brought to Lincoln's attention, because a Jew actually was barred from the chaplaincy, certainly had all the qualifications. He was Reverend Fischel. Arnold Fischel was at that time sort of the assistant rabbi, to use an anachronistic term, at Sheretz Israel, at the Spanish, what today is the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue. But the Secretary of War, we have the letter, has said, you're not a minister of some Christian denomination. And it's actually pretty interesting that instead of saying, well, it's wartime, we'll deal with this after the war, the Jewish community says we are fighting for the idea of Jewish equality and so on. And they send Fischel to Washington. He gets in to see Lincoln, and Lincoln engineered cleverly a way to reinterpret, or in the words of the law, construe the term minister of some Christian denomination to mean some religious denomination. Then he did something very clever. He stuck that idea into a much larger bill that gave raises to all the popular generals. Nobody votes against bills like that in wartime. It passed, and Lincoln promptly appointed the first Jewish chaplain. And because the chaplaincy is open to people of some religious denomination. Today we have Muslim chaplains, we had a Wiccan chaplain. It changed America. And it's fascinating, really, to see how a battle won by the Jewish community had implications for America generally.
Thank you, Jonathan. I think that's such a great example of the ways in this book how you're using a specific figure in history in order to give us this much wider lens into changes, not just for American Jews, but Americans more generally. And I think for many people reading this book, it never would have occurred to them that it would be so far back in time that you would have the first Jewish chaplain. So I have sort of a kind of parallel question for you that builds off of that. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about your scholarship is that a number of your books deal with Jewish relationships to famous non-Jewish Americans. So your book on Lincoln is an example, your book on Grant, and you have a new book that you're working on about Jews' relationship with Mark Twain. I wondered if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about what's the advantage or what these sorts of stories about famous non-Jews in American history, interacting with Jews, what do those add to our understanding of American Jewish history?
Well,
We're having a hard time hearing you again, unfortunately.
It'll come back. It seems
It's
to
back.
be.
Yes, it's
It
good.
seems to be on a delay. I can't explain it. If someone in this audience has an idea for me, put it in the chat. There's a tiny delay, but anyway, Mr. Chappelle, also was interested in the intersection of Jews and America. And in a way, for me at least, there's a very important statement there. American history is not somebody else's history. It's American Jews' history. They are part of American history. I, by the way, think in general, Jewish history should be studied as part of general history. Too often we raise young people to imagine that, oh, there's general history and then they're the Jews, as if they were forever apart and uninfluenced and not influencing in an active way those around them. But actually, it's not the case today, of course, and it was never the case. And part of what I've been doing, and then I want to say one other thing. Part of what I've been doing, though, is to try and break down that mechitza, so to speak, that barrier between Jewish history and general history. And I have the good fortune, I have a PhD in American history a million years ago. And I felt in order to understand American Jewish history, I needed that training in American history as well as in modern. But I did want to say one other thing, and you so kindly, as nobody before you has, point out Lincoln, Grant, and now working on Mark Twain. These are the great figures of the second half of the 19th century. And the 19th century is an amazing moment because Lincoln, Grant, and Mark Twain, Sam Clemens, when they grow up, they don't know any Jews. They grow up in small communities with essentially maybe a Jewish peddler came by once, but they knew Jews in the Bible. That's certainly true of Lincoln when he is growing up. The only Jew he knows is in the Bible. But then we move by 1840, there are 15,000 Jews. By 1850, they're 50,000. By the Civil War, there are 150,000, many of them from Central Europe, and they've spread all the way across the country, reaching, of course, California at the time of the gold rush. And most people did encounter Jews, and they were changed. Encounters will change both sides. We know that as historians. And Lincoln, Grant, and I think Mark Twain all were changed by their encounters with Jews. And actually, all three ended up, even Grant, and that's the point of my book on Grant, they all ended up with a much more positive view of Jews, that actually meeting them made a huge difference. And it's not unimportant, and I think has lots of contemporary relevance, that some of those great Americans fought the anti-Semitism of their time, some of it casual, some of it inherited prejudice, and indeed had Jewish friends, made Jewish appointments in the case of Lincoln and Grant, interacted with Jews, and just offered a very different model. And in some ways, that made America distinctive.
Yeah, thank you. I want to just quickly, you mentioned something about putting things in the chat or the Q&A. For people who have questions, definitely put them in the Q&A. That's where I'm going to go when we at about 6:45 to like pick up questions to bring from the audience. I do want to pick up on, though, one of your points about one of the benefits of looking at people like Lincoln and Grant and Mark Twain, that they're at this incredible moment in American history. And I really think of one of the sort of fascinating things about your work as a biographer is that biography really comes of age in the 19th century during Lincoln's lifetime. And I remember one critic a long time ago talking about this particular time period in the middle of the 19th century as a time period when Americans suddenly have this narcissistic fascination with the self. But I really think today biographies have kind of moved away from like, I'm just talking about a great person, and really trying to get at these larger cultural trends that really are kind of challenging why we're turning to biographies and why we get so much meaning out of them. And I do think of your biographies is such a good example of somebody who is looking at focusing through a person, but really getting at these big issues of what's happening during the time period. And part of that has to do with Jews, but I'm also sort of wondering, are there other kinds of big 19th century issues that we learn, our American history issues that we learn through this? And then maybe also, I'm going to bet that there's somebody else besides me out there who thinks of themselves as somebody who either writes biography or wants to write biography. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about your process of writing biographies and maybe any tips that you have for people.
Can't hear you again.
I'm
Sorry.
sorry. It'll come back.
Oh, there we go.
It always does. It's like the Jewish people. We always come back. But anyway, I would say that when I write about Lincoln or Grant or Twain, I'm looking at them through Jewish eyes. I certainly know that it's not the only way to see these people, but there are so many books on Lincoln. Indeed, that was the first impression. Aren't there enough books on Lincoln? Why not write about Rabbi so-and-so who nobody knows about? And the answer is, yeah, there are a lot of books on Lincoln, I think more than any other president, but nobody really had looked closely at Lincoln and the Jews, and even the Lincoln scholars had never looked at it from this vantage point. I should say there was an earlier edition. There's new material here, but the first edition won the Lincoln Prize, two, in fact. And they did because there's always something new. You go through it and you go through it. There's always something you haven't seen before. And I think that has always been my approach, that by looking at it through the eyes of a student of American Jewish life, who nevertheless certainly knows how to, go through and find original Lincoln sources and so on, I was able to find out much that was new and to embed Lincoln within American history, American Jewish history, and there are even elements in the book of kind of traditional Jewish history, because let's say expulsion is certainly a theme that Jews knew throughout their story. What's new is the apology and the overturning it. Ferdinand and Isabella never overturned the expulsion of Jews from Spain. But when Jews are expelled from General Grant's war zone, they remember it as part of a long history of expulsions, which certainly didn't end in Spain. And so one needs all of those subjects: American history, modern Jewish history, American Jewish history, and tries to bring all of that really together. And that's a very different vantage point than anybody who previously worked on those individuals who may not even have paid attention to the Jewish angle.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like it's such a good reminder to people when you're feeling overwhelmed by how much stuff has been written on somebody, to remember that we all bring something unique to the table and to try and figure out what's our perspective. And your incredible depth of knowledge about American Jewish history really adds something so unique in terms of the histories of these really important players in American life. But you did mention also this being the second edition, and I will put out there, you're one of those people that I super admire, that your second editions of books aren't just like the same thing with the little preface at the beginning. You really are adding new materials in. And one of the things that you mentioned in the preface to this is that there were new manuscripts that were found and collected but after the first edition came out, and that you were able to include in the second edition, and that sort of helped shape the second edition. And I wondered if you could maybe tell us about one or two of those that were your favorites and how they changed what we know about Lincoln. And I will say also, like, this is a little bit fangirlish, but I am one of those people, like, when you have a second edition, I go out and get the second edition, even if I have the first one, because there's something new in it. So I'm sure other people would be interested too. Like, what are some of those kernels that you're bringing to this new edition that are going to make us all want to go out and get it?
Well, don't speak. Let's wait for the delay. Hey,
For some reason, it helps if I interrupt you and tell you that we can't hear you, and then it will let you speak again.
Right
See,
away.
it worked. It's
It
like
worked.
magic.
There's a dibbook there. We need to figure it out. Anyway, first of all, for people who have the first edition, of course, the first edition was album size. Very hard to take on an airplane, as someone once complained to me. They wanted to read it, didn't go well. This is a paperback size, and very different. But yes, there are new documents. One should thank heavily Ben Chappelle, who has acquired some of those documents. My favorite, just because of its historic significance, is the first American Jewish political broadside. Most people thought that Jews didn't engage in American politics really until the 20th century. A very, very distinguished historian wrote that in a book on German Jewry about how Jews didn't go out into the political arena. And then, lo and behold, here is a broadside by Jews calling on Jews in 1864 to vote for Abraham Lincoln. Sure, they say it's extraordinary. Normally, we wouldn't tell Jews, and so on. It's fascinating for me because, as I had shown earlier in the Grant book, 1868, when Grant ran, there was a tremendous amount of Jewish political engagement. But now I know that even in 1864, there was political involvement, and the broadside is mostly signed by people we know almost nothing about, ordinary Jews, a lot of them from Pennsylvania, but they believe that it's necessary to vote for Lincoln. It's quite fascinating because it does not mention the two matters that we would have imagined they would mention first. It doesn't say the chaplaincy, we have Jewish chaplains, and it doesn't say he overturned Grant's order. A reminder that that really wasn't well appreciated until the 20th century. Historians look back. They talk about the Civil War, the need for the Union to win. There's certainly a sense of ending slavery. But in any case, notwithstanding the taboo, which was a European idea that Jews shouldn't engage in politics because then maybe that will undermine the emancipation that they have been granted. It's fascinating that these Jewish immigrants understood America doesn't put those limits. We can have a broadside calling on Jews. And this, of course, was in the first edition, and I was so excited to find that Lincoln thought about the Jewish vote already in 1860. He's got a Jewish advisor, who is Jonas, who is helping him on strategy. And the idea is, hey, this new Republican Party should put together a coalition. And one of the coalition partners that Jonas explicitly mentions are the Jews. Now, I suspect that the Jewish vote was a lot less important than mentioned in Jonas's talk. How many? 50,000 votes total, maybe. But still, it's a reminder that politicians understood elections are close. We want to engage with lots of voters, Jewish voters included. And that's been a feature of America much longer than most people imagine.
Yeah, I think when I was reading the second edition, I was really struck by your discussion about Jews and politics as part of Lincoln's career and exactly what you're talking about. Like they're both people working as individuals, but also people who are sort of binding either Jews together in their imagination or Jews coming together to have seen as having some kind of collective issues that are on the table as a group as well. And I felt like it was such a resonant issue for today, where we're also seeing that sort of issue of like, our what's aligning people in terms of political interest and like what does it mean to cater to certain subgroups within American culture. So it was for me one of the things that was keeps making this such a fresh piece of history that it continues to have all these ways that it plays out for us. I want to pick up on something that you said though about Mr. Chappelle and his collection, because I feel like, whew, like such a gift to have somebody who's collecting really important pieces of Americana. Like often they wind up in little random places. So that's really been like clearly such a boon. I'm sure it's a mutual thing that I'm sure he's happy to have like the preeminent American Jewish historian working on his collection as well. But I I also know that he has, well, so one thing I would point out for people who are getting the newer version, even though it's smaller, you have a lot of really cool pictures of manuscripts, and you also had some cool images and bios of Jewish Civil War soldiers. And I know that Mr. Chappelle also has the Chappelle's roster of Jewish service in the American Civil War, which is this huge, incredible website of the Jewish soldiers who served in the Civil War. I could probably bring it up and share it for people too. But I know that it seemed like it was something that was coming up in this book, but I suspect it's also been behind some of your other books when you've written a book with Adam Mendelsohn, which was on Jews in the Civil War. I wonder if you could maybe tell us a little bit more about that collection. And again, I'll share screen and put it up so people can see it, and how sources like that help with your writing process in this or other related books. And of course, it's not going to like tell us.
Well,
It is now. You're good. You're good.
Yeah, that's about 20 seconds. Okay. Anyway, there's the Chappelle roster. I have to say that they were just beginning to get this work done when the first edition of Lincoln was there. It was in progress. The idea of the Chappelle register is not, I mean, who were the Jews who fought in the Civil War? We had an old list by Simon Wolf, which was poor, using names and so on. And he's got a whole group of researchers. And the truth is that the roster is an archive that can be mined by any student of 19th century America, because here you've got all these soldiers, and a lot of them later asked for pensions. And as part of asking for pensions, they had to submit all sorts of data. So, for example, really two students of mine have pioneered in using the roster in different ways. One is, as you mentioned, Adam Mendelsohn, whose book on Union soldiers really offers all sorts of new insights. It's the most important book on the Jewish soldiers in the Union, really, since Bertram Korn in the 50s. And he was able to make heavy use of the Chappelle register. But another one of my students has a book coming out, Ben Steiner, about a marriage contract. Now you'd think, marriage contract, Chappelle register? Well, it turned out that in order to prove that they or their spouses deserve pensions, so some of them sent up ketubot, Jewish marriage materials, and it found its way into government records. and the Chappelle roster noted it, and these offered certain examples to Ben. So I'm sure that this great resource will be used in all sorts of ways that nobody imagined when they were putting it together, and help move us from just studying the great men of the 19th century, Rabbi Leeser, Reverend Leeser, and Rabbi Wise, and so on, and move out to study the people, the folk, those poor guys who had to fight in the Civil War, not what they quite had bargained for. The interactions which Mendelssohn talks about between different immigrant groups suddenly thrown together into an army. So it's a great resource. And I feel very pleased that to have been able to work with someone who has a great appreciation for primary sources. And let me say that at a moment in America where many people have trouble figuring out what's truth, how do we know what truth is? Is it anything that anybody says? Well, no, there are documents, and you have to prove what you are saying. And that's why having those documents, and Mr. Chappelle rightly wanted in the book. You have a different interpretation? That's fine. There are many interpretations. Here's the document. Read it. Teach it. Let's study these primary sources, and let's help students understand how truth really is determined from the primary materials that historians use.
Thank you. That's such an important point about what we do as historians, but also what the benefit is of including those sources in there, that it really does allow people to sort of interact with the materials themselves and to get a sense of what that larger history is. So it's already 6:45. I had so many more other things I wanted to ask you about, but I'm going to go ahead and see if I can pull some of the different questions out of the piece. One of them is somebody was interested in hearing a little bit more about the book you're working on with Mark Twain. Do you want to give us just a little hint of something of what you're interested in with that? And then I'll go ahead and bring in some of the other questions.
Sure. Am I live or no? Oh,
we
good.
can hear you. Yeah.
Amazing. Miracles never cease. I think that some listeners will know Mark Twain's remarkable and so timely essay concerning the Jews, which is really written at a period of great American anti-Semitism in the late 1890s. Maybe a few people know that Mark Twain visited the Holy Land in the 1860s, and his book, Innocents Abroad, deals with that, but it's not kind of integrated into the story of Mark Twain at all. And in both cases, I could go on. I mean, I'm not going to give the whole book away, but, who knew? I certainly didn't when I started that was the very first steam travel direct from America to the land of Israel. That's why they were happy to have a journalist to record it. But steam changed all of history. The fact that I could get on a boat in New York and get to Palestine in time certain, without worrying, and actually in considerable luxury, and tour and then come home and know that, oh, if I leave on this day, I'll be back on that day. That changed everything. The truth is, there wouldn't be Zionism without steam. We've totally overlooked the great importance of it as you know, in early America. People thought, oh, yeah, well, we'll fly on eagle's wings, or maybe a big cloud will come and carry us to the land of Israel. Don't try that as home, as we're told to tell students. But now, just 60, 70 years later, everybody knows how to get to the land of Israel. You get on a boat, and it's easy and safe. So that's part of one story. And the Twain in anti-Semitism, he's sitting in Vienna. Vienna has a mayor who self-describes. First time he had a mayor who described himself as an anti-Semite, and Vienna, which is also Herzl's Vienna, is rife with anti-Semitism. And that's the background to that essay. He described anti-Semitism based on what he had seen and how he was shocked. I have a lot of other amazing material, but I think I'd like to wait until the book actually is finished, and then we'll come back and talk about it.
Okay, sounds good. I'll hold you to that, Jonathan. So we have a really good question, which is, somebody was interested in what's the difference of the influence of Jews in the Confederacy as compared to in the Union?
So actually, Adam Mendelsohn, I believe, is writing a new book using Chappelle materials. Of course, Lincoln is only talking about the Union. I think that in the Confederacy, it is certainly true. There are far fewer Jews in the Confederacy, but they hold very high positions. It was really astonishing to Jews all over the world to see Judah Benjamin, Secretary eventually of State of the Confederacy, probably the most high-ranking government Jew in the whole world at that time. And there were plenty of other Jews. Now, Jews rose up in the Confederacy, let's remember, because there was a different outgroup. There were African Americans, and Jews were, of course, part of a white minority that wanted to rule what was really a majority. So the situation was different. There were occasional anti-Semitic incidents in the Confederacy, but in Jewish memory, at least, the Confederacy was a little better for the Jews, and the world of the Confederacy was different as well, because in the North, you had so many Jews in the clothing trade, and that was crucial. And of course, the Civil War gives a tremendous boost to ready-made clothing. If I needed to give a historical analogy, it's like COVID gave an enormous boost to Zoom. It put on steroids. Rarely has technology moved so quickly. And so it was in the Civil War. because so many soldiers needed to be clothed, and ready-made clothing, Jews were totally disproportionate in their involvement. They also made a lot of money in the Civil War, because if you owned a clothing factory, you did very well. And none of that is true in the South, because the South wasn't making clothing. Even slave clothes are made in New York. So those are some of the differences. When Professor Mendelssohn's book is finished, I'm sure we'll have a larger picture of that.
Thank you so much. So another really good sort of big picture question that somebody had was, what's the general Jewish community's attitude on slavery, which I feel is something you do talk a lot about in this book.
Yeah, look, you can find all sorts of views on slavery. And I think in some way, Jews were not so different from their neighbors in that respect. Some of the very recent literature before my Lincoln, tried to persuade us, because today some Jewish historians, not you, think you can't say anything good about Jews. You're not objective. So they tried to persuade us Jews really supported slavery. They were involved in clothing the slaves and so on. That's absolutely right. That's exactly what they were. But as I tried to show here, you also had Jews, an interesting group of what we might call 48ers, meaning Jews who had left Central Europe after the failed 1848 revolution. Very important and interesting group of people. And they were full of high ideals, and they loved Lincoln, and they hated slavery, and they were they were part of this coalition. So you can find Jews at every point. It is worth remembering, and again, it has all these contemporary resonances. We would imagine, oh, abolitionists, Jews should flock. But actually, a lot of the abolitionists turned out to be deep anti-Semites. William Lloyd Garrison on Jews horrified the editor of the Garrison papers, and Jews knew that. It was in the American Israelite. And so that made it tough for Jews. This side doesn't like us, and that side doesn't like us. But I certainly can point to Jews. A very good example is a man named Judge Dittenhofer, who grew up in the South and then comes north, and actually he persuades his family that slavery is wrong and wicked, and he really moves ideologically into Lincoln's camp. He later wrote a book modestly and not quite correctly titled "We Elected Lincoln," but it gives a sense of how strongly he felt. But then, you certainly had Jews, Charleston, who really supported slavery. And there's a new a diary that Melissa Clapper and Diane Ashton have just brought out of a young woman in the Confederacy. And it's not so pretty what she has to say after Lincoln is assassinated. So you can really see that Jews were everywhere on the spectrum, and maybe that broadens their understanding of Jews, even as it reminds us, since we're looking back, that sometimes following blindly in the ways of your neighbors can get you into trouble, and your descendants will be a bit ashamed of you. That too is a lesson, I think, from the Civil War.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I feel like your book is such a good example of getting at really the nuances of the diversity of Jewish experience. And I think we have time for one last question. So I'll give one of the questions that somebody had that I think actually gets at this issue a little bit, which was they were interested in you talking about Jewish involvement in American politics. And they were wondering what the religious leading of those Jews was. Is it Orthodox Jews and Reform Jews? Is it like mainly secular Jews? Like, is it across the religious spectrum? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what kinds of Jews Lincoln is interacting with.
Lincoln actually interacts both with Rabbi Raphael. We remember Rabbi Raphael as for a sermon he delivered on slavery, which tried to find a middle ground, but from our perspective is morally insensitive. But we forget that Raphael had 2 children in the Civil War, siding with the Union, and Raphael later supports Lincoln. And he's, of course, the rabbi of B'nai Jeshurun, a very important rabbi. But even more interesting, because you had Reform Jews on both sides. Isaac Mayer Wise was a Democrat, and he thinks that Lincoln is primitive, and it's like the Landjunker, who's for the first time come to the city, he wrote. When Lincoln was assassinated, he said, oh, Lincoln was a Jew. I knew that. But anyway, but you certainly had rabbis like David Einhorn is the most famous, who were abolitionists or staunchly anti-slavery. One of the contributions, and we'll close with this, is a Sephardic rabbi, Sabbato Moraeus. The rabbi didn't use that term, of Mikveh Israel, later one of the founders of the Jewish Theological Seminary, who is in love with Lincoln and a strong supporter of Lincoln. And one of the amazing things that we found about this is that Moraeus gave a sermon, and we know he sent his sermons to Lincoln. And how did that sermon begin? 7 years ago. I can't prove that Lincoln took it from there, but it sure broadens, because that wasn't everyday language. And of course, Moraeus knew his Bible inside out, even the English translation. And I'm glad for the question. It's not an Orthodox monopoly, Reform monopoly. You can find people on various sides. I could point to Orthodox rabbis who supported slavery, one in Baltimore and one in the Confederacy, and Reform rabbis too, on both sides. Jews were divided. They disagreed with one another. Who would have imagined? In a way, the past reminds us that divisions in the Jewish people, which some people think just began in the 21st century, really have a very long history. So thank you, Laura, so much for
Oh my gosh, such a pleasure. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for sharing your wisdom with all of us and for this magnificent book. And I'll turn it back over to our hosts. And there's a link also if people would like to purchase the book. There's a link in the chat that you can go to get to all of Jonathan's books and this one in particular.
All right.
Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.
Bye.